Hello. We are back to chapter 14 as we continue to talk about the Civil War. When we left off in section 1, we are looking at the causes of the war and some of the comparisons of the two sides as they headed into battle. Today we're going to pick up with the actual battles, some information to start off with that'll help us to understand about the armies, and then looking at battles and a few profiles of people involved in this conflict. So let's go ahead and get started. In section 2, we'll see we're talking about the war in the East. The next two sections, 3 and 4, will run parallel to this section, so we'll see some dates that take us back and look at conflicts on different fronts and on the home front. So we'll pick up with that, and then our last section is over the conclusion of the war, and we'll pick up with that. So as we start, we're looking at the beginning of this conflict. Most of the fighting on the Eastern Front will take place in Virginia. It's close to both of the capitals, Washington, D.C. for the North, or the Union, and Richmond was the new capital for the Confederacy. Both sides thought this would be a very quick war. They thought one big decisive battle at the beginning could end this whole conflict, and so the initial enlistments for soldiers, when they called them up, was only for 3 months because they felt that it was going to be a short war. Now, some information to understand as we go through and referencing things. The North is the Union Army, and we see that as we go through this, the North will name the battles after nearby water sources. So many of these conflicts do have two names to them. Sometimes I'll reference both of those as we go through and discuss. But the North were water sources like Bull Run Creek, and as their name of their army was the Army of the Potomac River that runs through Washington, D.C. So here are some flags that were representative as we started this conflict. And we have the 34-star American flag, including the admission of Kansas as the 34th state into the U.S. at the beginning of 1861. And the other flag here is the battle flag of the Army of the Potomac. Next, we have the South, which was the Confederate Army. The South will name their battles after nearby towns or landmarks. Examples of this was Sharpsburg, Maryland, was the town where we'll see usually called Antietam, and Manassas Junction, a train station, was what they named their battle after instead of Bull Run. The major Confederate Army was the Army of Northern Virginia. These two flags here are representative of the Army's flag, and the more commonly known symbol of the known flag of the Confederacy is included here because it is also a battle flag. Now, when we talk about the flags of the Confederacy, like we have the American flag, they also had their own flags. This is the first national flag that came out in 1861. This was called the Stars and Bars. It starts out with the initial 7 states that were part of the Confederacy, starting with South Carolina, crossed over to Texas, and then we will add those additional 4 after Fort Sumter. Some flags even went up to having 13 stars on them to symbolically include Kentucky and Missouri, who never actually seceded but were considered part of the Confederacy by many. This flag will go from 1861 to 1863 when the stainless banner was introduced. Looking at this, do you see anything wrong with this picture? As you might imagine, there's a lot of white surface here, so this very often in the heat of battle looked like a flag of surrender. And so they decided that this was not going to work. The third national flag, also called the bloodstained banner, was was introduced in 1865, right before the end of the conflict, within the last month of the war. But the section here is usually the most recognizable portion of that and continues to still be associated with the South in many ways, and connections back to the Civil War. Now, the first battle of the conflict after Fort Sumter, when the two armies were joining up, was at the First Bull Run, or the First Manassas. So this took place on July 21st, 1861. You can see Manassas here close to both of the capitals, the Confederate capital and DC. Now this is the home of Wilbur McLean. He had moved out of the city, wanted to get out into a place that would be more quiet for his family, so he moved close to a train station, Manassas Junction, and had a beautiful creek, Bull Run, that ran right in front of his house. The war started in his kitchen when a cannonball came through the chimney and into the soup that was cooking there. He goes out onto his front yard to see the gatherings of people out of Washington, D.C., which was about 25 miles from this location, coming out in their finery, men in their tuxes, ladies in their fine dresses with their picnic baskets to watch the war begin. They thought this would be the one battle that they'd get to watch, and then things would be over. Some of the men even joined up and started fighting alongside the troops that they saw in those tuxedos. But unfortunately, those people are quickly overrun as the troops are in the path of surrender and getting out of Dodge as they will run. Now this conflict, it was a Confederate victory. The South was able to put the North on the run. They end this very confident, while the North will be more demoralized, not knowing what their next step will be, but it's going to be very obvious to both at this point that this is not going to be a quick war. Throughout this section, we'll be looking at several battles, but I'll be skipping over many. If you're a big Civil War buff, then you'll probably want to do some of your own research, but just for the times and from this medium of coverage, it's going to be pretty difficult to get through everything. So I want to encourage you to look into that in other ways. But I do want to highlight a few interesting aspects, not just straight from the battles, but one example of this was the introduction, of ironclad ships. We have the CSS Virginia, which had been repurposed, had formerly been the USS Merrimack. The Confederacy had taken this ironclad and reworked it for themselves. And the USS Monitor was also going to be included in this. We see these two will fight. It is to a draw. There's really no victor in this conflict, but the age of wooden warships has ended at this point. The USS Constitution, that first ship, their day has passed, and now it's going to be the Ironclads. So just for interesting, here is an example of, or here's a drawing of the CSS Virginia. You can see its length. It had a crew of up to 380 on board. Looks very very long here, 262, and will be fighting against the Monitor, which was often called a cheese box on a raft. It has the gun turret here in the center that could move to shoot, but a smaller version here at only 173 feet and 52 crewmen was far smaller than the USS Virginia. So this was going to be one new form of technology and military might that will be used. We'll talk about others as we go through. Now the second Battle of Bull Run, after we have some conflicts, we return to this site later in 1862. This is where the Confederates will take victory under Robert E. Lee, who's going to lead the charge, and is able to clear most of Virginia from the Union troops, pushes them out of the region and back into their home base in Washington, D.C. And so Lee's going to also make some plans to invade into the Union territory at Sharpsburg, Maryland. So just talking a little bit about Robert E. Lee. His father had been an officer in the Revolutionary War, so he had that military history as part of his own history, and he would go on to attend school at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. During his 4 years there, he was a model soldier. He received no demerits. which was a no small task when if you had a piece of dirt on your shoe or there was a wrinkle in your blanket on your bed, you could get a demerit. He was an example of almost perfection there. He served in conflicts like the Mexican War, had several military assignments, including being the superintendent in charge of things at West Point. When the war breaks out, his loyalty is tested. Is going to be loyal to the U.S. Army that he serves in for so long, or will he be loyal to his home state of Virginia and return there to fight as part of the Confederacy? So we know he does go back to Virginia, leaving behind all that he knows to join up with the Confederate cause. Now, leaving many of his friends behind in this case, some were not happy with his choice, and so there was a moment of retaliation in this. Robert E. Lee's home with his wife, Mary, was called Arlington. This mansion had been built by the grandson of Martha Washington and handed down from father to daughter for Mary, and so they owned this mansion. And in retaliation, though, they will capture Arlington, force the Lees out, and will turn their front yard into the Arlington National Cemetery to begin burying the Civil War dead there. And so it is a moment of symbol, as you can see his house here overlaying where all of starting with the Civil War through conflicts today, where still the pride of our country, the military who have passed in service to their country are buried here. But you can see his home up on the top here. In some places it even has rose bushes that were planted during the lifetime of George Washington. So at this point, we're going to a to be continued. As Lee makes his way to the north, to this Union-held area for our next battle, we'll continue our discussion. We'll be picking up as he moves his way into Maryland.